So I want to welcome everyone to the workshop today, Equity in the Classroom, Moving Towards Anti-Racist Teaching Practices. My name is Leticia Rojas. I am currently education faculty at Pasadena City College and also coordinator for the Hixon Teacher Prep Program. I know this is like the fourth day of the conference and some of you have attended different workshops. So I want to thank you for choosing this one, for being present for the next hour. We're just going to get started with a conversation today and hopefully continue it. But if you haven't had a chance to, make sure you go into the Zoom chat. Let me know who you are, what college campus, or if you're part of the community, what's your role, anything that you'd like for us to know about you. And so I'll try to keep an eye out. I know folks are joining us as we speak, so I'm going to hopefully continue and then we'll embrace everyone as they come in. But I always like to start with how I come into this space. I myself am a first-gen college student, so I was the first in my family to go to college. Identify as Chicana, Mexican-American, Mexican, Latina, depending on context and depending on who I'm around. But I do definitely identify as a woman of color. I'm a daughter of immigrants, so my two parents are from Zacatecas, Mexico, and came to this country many years ago. And even though they emphasize education quite a bit, let's just make sure we're muted, folks. Even though they emphasize education quite a bit, they themselves were only able to go to the 6th grade. And so for me, teachers were incredibly important. And I talk about this because for me, a lot of my politicization happened in college, in undergrad. And I had experiences in my K through 12 teaching or learning, I should say, my own education, where I rarely saw educators of color, folks that looked like me. I definitely didn't read any books with Chicana protagonists. And it wasn't until college that I began to really unpack history, took Chicano studies, took women's studies, ethnic studies, and began to think about, well, why didn't I experience this at the K through 12 level? And so that was really important for me as when I became a teacher to make sure that that was part of my philosophy. So I did teach high school English for 10 years in Los Angeles Unified School District for a high school in the Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles area, Roosevelt High School. So there's always one or two people who either attended Roosevelt or whose parents attended Roosevelt. So if that's you, give a little love in the chat. And then I've been in teacher education for the last 5.5 years. Previous to Pasadena City College, I was a teacher educator at the 4-year college level for Brandman University. Yeah, shout out to UCLA. And these pictures are myself and my family. It's a little outdated. The little girl you see there is now 27. And a college graduate herself, went to San Jose State. And then the picture on the right is a picture of me with my students who were part of the Gay Straight Alliance, which I was one of the co-advisors for. So I'll talk a little bit about my work with youth a little later. But I do want to know what brought you to this space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop something in the chat. If it's your first time using Jamboard, then you're going to click on the chat or click on the link and it'll take you to a slide here. You're able to add sticky notes, you're able to type directly into the Jamboard. If you're not comfortable with Jamboard, go ahead and answer in the Zoom chat. But I'm curious, what brings you to this space, right? We all have different reasons why we enter spaces, people that we bring with us, right? It's not just us physically or virtually in a space. So I want to give folks a little bit of time to go ahead and answer this question. What brings you to this space? Why teaching? What is your motivation? So I'll give you about a minute or so to, again, add your answer to the Jamboard. And for folks coming in, I'm going to put the link again in the Zoom chat. So what brings you to this space? And you can click on this sticky note here if you want to write anything directly on there. So for me, it would be my family, right? So I'll give folks a little bit more time. I love to learn and pass on information. Thank you so much. So folks are using the same note, looking for good ideas to add to my ESL class in East Los Angeles, becoming a better anti-racist educator, family love, looking for good ideas to build my class, loving the knowledge that I'm gaining from these workshops, enjoying learning something new to pass on to someone new, right? Loving the knowledge I'm gaining. Okay. So you might still be typing. I apologize, just for time's sake. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but folks are also typing into the Zoom chat, becoming better, want to be able to help the next generation, to inspire children or kids, push them and let them know someone believes in them, right? Love this. And Jamboard is just one of the ways in which we can get our students to collaborate in a virtual world, right? Okay. I apologize if you're still typing. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And for folks just joining, thank you so much. Oops. I think someone did a little scratch there. We can go ahead and erase that, but hopefully it doesn't bother folks too much. So just a little bit before we get started, setting the context, I want to make sure from the beginning that I acknowledge the diversity within groups and intersectionality. Even though we're going to be talking about race, I always in my classes, I make the point that when we talk about gender, when we talk about sexuality, when we talk about language, it is all intersectional, right? So I am a queer woman of color. I can't just untangle the pieces of me, right? I am all of those things. And so just as we look at, conversations around English language learners, somebody posted that earlier, just as we talk about gender in our classroom, we always have to layer the conversation with a racialized lens as well, right? Also, this notion that race is a social construct, right? And that racism exists in our institutions and societies. Like, let's just start there, right? Let's not have to have the conversation about whether racism even exists. Let's just start at the basic level of racism exists and has existed historically and permeates our institutions. So if we can start there, then the conversation can go that much further, right? And also this idea that reform is not the answer, right? That often in education, we're really good at putting bandages on things or changing things up, but that to really kind of fundamentally change our teaching practice, to change an institution, we have to reimagine another way. And Bettina Love writes about this in her books, and she speaks about this, that that educators are some of the most creative people, because we have to imagine a world that hasn't existed, right? There has been no society, at least in our kind of current collective memory, that has been equitable, right? At least from colonization and forward, and even before, right? So I'm gonna hopefully start from kind of that beginning point. And then I'm going to navigate between my experiences as a high school teacher and now a teacher educator. So this is just a little bit of a conversation, obviously just an hour, right? So we're just getting started. And then for whoever drew the little red line, if you're able to go to the Jamboard and delete it, that would be awesome. But if not, then we'll make do. Yeah. So I did want to start with this idea of education, whether you're in the TK through 12 level or in teacher education, because I know folks are from different contexts here, we often talk about education as an institution, right? So maybe our students are coming into our 6th grade class and we ask them, what's the purpose of schooling? What does it mean to you? In our teacher education classes, we ask our future teachers, why did you choose to teach, right? And then we jump into the history of schools, and we start to talk about philosophies of education like perennialism, and we talk about John Dewey, but we don't sometimes contextualize the fact that we're kind of stepping into an institution that has a problematic past, right? Just if you were going to be a doctor going into the medical field, you would hopefully learn about some of the ways that medicine has been disproportionately problematic for people of color, right? If you were going to any sort of field. And so it's important, I know these images can be strong, it's important to reckon with our racist and oppressive past, right? So the picture on the top is a child who was forced to attend a Native American Indian boarding school. And that's part of our past, right? Where we took children from indigenous communities, separated them from their families, and forced them to attend schools which were focused on assimilation, right? And so from the beginning, our schools have had an assimilationist angle where children of color feel like they can't be their full selves, right? That they have to assimilate to a Eurocentric culture. Of course, the image on the upper right is, going back to this history of segregation in our schools, right? And prior to Brown versus Board of Education, we had segregation in our very backyard in Orange, the city of Orange, or in Orange County, where Mexican students were not able to go to schools with white children. And so when we're teaching about the history of education, we often talk about it at a federal level or a national level, but we can have students explore what happened in their very communities, right? The history of Pasadena, the history of Los Angeles. I taught at Roosevelt High School, so we often talked about the different episodes or in historical moments that happened in Boyle Heights and East Los Angeles, from like the Zoot Suit rebellion to the Chicano movement, etc. Right? And this quote, "A child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him, and a child cannot afford to be fooled," right? This idea that children are able to see through when institutions don't value who they are, right? So I want to stop here and have you go into the Zoom chat. What other forms of oppression can you think of that occur in schools currently, right? So we talked a little bit about the past, but what's an example of the ways in which schools might perpetuate social injustice, right? When we think about social reproduction, like we don't teach in a vacuum. We're part of a larger society, right? So I want you to think of across race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, language, immigration, other identities. What are some examples of the ways in which schools potentially oppress different student populations? So expulsion of brown and black children, definitely, right? The overrepresentation. And feel free if anybody wants to talk through the mic.
Oh, I was gonna ask, and I don't know if this is it, but like when they have something and kids can't afford it, so they can't do it. Like, yeah. So they don't have the money to join something that this school's putting on. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. So access in terms of income, but also the funding, the ways in which schools are funded, right? We know that schools in working class communities have less access to funds than other schools, right? We don't even have to look at the specifics. We can just talk to folks who have these anecdotes of, well, when I went to school, we used to go on all these field trips. And now, many schools, the first things to go are the arts or teachers or particular programs that we know keep our kids in schools, right? I used to have a student who didn't come to my class very regularly at the high school level, and then used to come more often. And I found out that he had joined band, right? And band, a class that was completely separate than my English class, was one of the things that he loved to come to school for, right? And so even being humbled by that and saying, okay, like, it's not my class that's bringing you, but I'm glad you're here, and let's get you participating in all of these different things, right? So as we think about, the history of exclusion, some of you are mentioning this, past and present. Curriculum often does not represent diversity, right? Many of our schools at the TK through 12 level, and I would even argue the teacher ed level, right? Because who are the folks that we often talk about repeatedly? It has a very Eurocentric approach, right? Or if we do talk about indigenous communities, we often talk about them at the beginning of colonization as if they didn't exist before colonization, right? So what does a decolonial form of education look like? We know research tells us that students of color tend to attend schools with lower teacher expectations, overcrowded schools, less access to AP and honors courses, And we know that overwhelmingly that the teaching field is not diverse, right? We don't have as many teachers of color as we would like, so that students can see themselves in that profession. And so all of these things, many of you know, right? Whether you're a teacher or you're a student who experienced them. But as we think about the ways in which, you know, racism and racism permeates our different contexts, it's important to think about, well, what does it look like on a daily basis, right? For me, when I taught high school, it looked like the textbooks that I was given, or it looked like when I went into the textbook room, 90% of all the books that were available to me to teach to my English class were written by white men, or they had white protagonists, right? As if only 14-year-old white young men are the only ones to come of age, right? Or the only books that we were reading. And so what I had to do then is take a step back and say, okay, this is not going to work with my philosophy of teaching. It's not going to work with my students who were 99% Latinx, right? That's institutional racism, when you have a school of 98 to 90% Latinx students, and yet your materials are very Eurocentric, right? And so I had to figure out, okay, how do I make sure that I have different novels represented? How do I, try not to go broke buying class sets of different things? How do I, as a first year teacher, bring in speakers, bring in poets, bring in community resources that would help me with my students? Okay. So I'm going to show you just a quick video, and then we're going to switch the conversation to, okay, so what do we do, right? What are some examples of anti-racist practices? But I want to show you just a video to kind of contextualize, and please, if you can go into the Zoom chat and just write out your responses.
All our lives, we're told that education is the key to success and that having a high school and college diploma will open up career doors. But not everyone gets the same access to a good, quality public education.
Growing up, being in Chicago public schools, I always was in classrooms feeling like, I wasn't learning anything.
Hey guys, I'm Dina, this is AJ Plus, and today we're looking at the challenges that students of color face trying to get an education in our school system. People of color make up 40% of our student population, but only 17% of our teaching force. And that's a major obstacle preventing students from getting an equal education, because a lack of teacher diversity impacts student performance. In the last decade, we've lost 26,000 African American teachers, even though teaching as a profession has been growing. AJ Plus recently visited Chicago, a city that's lost 40% of its Black teachers since 2002. We spoke to G2 Brown, a community activist there, who told us how the schools have changed in his lifetime.
Went to elementary school with a diverse teaching staff, so I had the veteran Black teachers, but I had white teachers. I had a Puerto Rican teacher, right? I had love from all shades, but I was able to look at a teacher and see myself, which is dangerous today because with the advent of privatization, Black teachers are disappearing from the public school system. And so that's my son's reality.
This is also the reality for students all over the United States, including New Orleans, which has lost more than 60% of its Black teachers, and Los Angeles, where there's been a 33% decrease since 2002. So why is this happening? Well, many factors are contributing to the decline, including low retention rates for Black teachers. These losses are also the result of the massive restructuring of education that's taken place in the last few years, including the closing of low-performing schools and their replacement with charter schools. Many of these low-performing schools were staffed with minority teachers who had roots in the community, and when they're gone, students suffer. In addition to providing students of color with strong role models, the number of Black teachers directly influences how Black students perform academically. It significantly decreases the likelihood of Black male youth from dropping out of high school. And a Vanderbilt study found that Black students were enrolled in gifted programs half as often as their white peers, even when they had the same achievement scores. But that gap narrowed dramatically when high-achieving Black students had a Black teacher. Other studies have shown that white teachers have lower expectations for their Black students, assuming they won't graduate from high school or earn a college degree, and that those lower standards may be self-fulfilling prophecies.
You're supposed to look at that little boy, and despite the fact that little boy may not comb his hair, despite the fact that little boy doesn't talk a lot, you have to watch them, you have to engage with their child, so you start realizing what they do well. Then you use what they do well to build their sense of self. And then you begin to challenge them to do more.
The number of minority teachers also impacts how students of color are disciplined. And discipline plays a critical role in this equation because it determines whether or not students are in the classroom at all. You may have heard of zero tolerance policies, a trend among schools to crack down on minor infractions with harsh penalties, like suspension for being late or violating the dress code. The rise of these policies nationwide led to a doubling in the number of students suspended between 1974 and 2001. Zero tolerance also resulted in the increased presence of police officers in schools, which is another part of a trend you may have heard about, the school-to-prison pipeline. The school-to-prison pipeline describes how students are increasingly being punished in the juvenile or criminal justice systems rather than by school officials for things like. All our lives, we're told that education is the key to success and that having a high school and college diploma.
Okay, so just for time's sake, I'm gonna try to unpack that a little bit, and please, type your thoughts into the chat. There's a great conversation happening. Thank you so much for dropping the information on the program, right? So as we think about teacher education, and those of you that are coming into teaching, there's initiatives, right, to begin to diversify the teaching force, or to continue, I should say, to diversify the teaching force. Interestingly enough, again, we always have to layer our conversations in history, right? Because prior to Brown versus Board of Education, when many school districts were segregated, Black teachers actually had the highest rate of education compared to any teacher, with an average of a master's degree. I remember learning about this early on in my teacher education, and part of it was because teaching was one of the avenues, right, that folks could pursue. When Brown versus Board of Education happened, of course, we began to desegregate schools, but one of the unintended consequences, or intended consequences, depending on how you're seeing it, is that when students were sent to the same school, many of the first teachers fired were Black educators, right? So there's always a historical context to our conversation. I think it's important to ground that, right? And so again, as we begin to think about, well, what does it mean to be a teacher of color working in the classroom, and not just a teacher of color, it could also be a white teacher, but what does it mean to be an anti-racist teacher? Right? Not someone who has racism on their radar and is thinking about diversity, but what does it mean to actually intentionally curate and craft your learning experiences with that lens, right? So just some things to think through, how might racism and discrimination play out in the classroom? What does anti-racist teacher look like? Racism practices look like? So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the work I've been doing with other folks. I know many of you are already engaging in this work, so please, share into the chat if you're doing this, if you're doing it better, if you're doing it more exciting. I think we're all trying to learn from each other collectively. So one of the areas in which I think about anti-racist teaching is through the content. And again, I'm going to talk about both my experience as a high school teacher, but also now as a teacher educator, because I know there's different folks in this space. One of my courses that I teach is Introduction to Elementary Teaching, right? And so I structure my class in 3 different ways. The first kind of big chunk of my class is, well, let's learn about the different content areas. Like, what are the standards for teaching across English, math, science, history, etc. But also looking at it from an equity lens, right? So it's not like there's an equity week in my class, right? We're always looking at it through that lens. But then I specifically spend some time in the second chunk of my class to begin to unpack, well, what does it mean to work effectively with students of color, with students across gender, sexuality? Again, always with that intersectionality in mind. What is our work with linguistically diverse students? And we even look at the history of language in terms of what we've called students, right? And we just talked about students who have diverse abilities or exceptional learners, right? So as much as I can, and I know many folks are doing this work, centering the lives of people of color in the curriculum, right? So not having them be an add-on and continuing to do the traditional curriculum that many schools are engaged in, but what does it mean to center the lives of people of color and their experiences in everything that we do, right? Challenging Eurocentric forms of knowledge production, right? So when we think about colonization, one of the consequences of colonization is that we became a very individualistic, kind of community, or I should say society that's really focused on competition, and not necessarily a constructive community way of knowledge production, right? So what that means is, in my classes, I want to make sure that we are creating knowledge together, right? What does it mean to have a dialogue with one another? So if now that because of COVID, we're in the virtual setting, students are in breakout rooms doing activities, and then we're coming back as a whole class to talk through what are the different conversations that they're having. It's harder to do in a virtual platform, but it's necessary work, right? Especially if we're training future teachers. One of the assignments that I have my students do in my intro to elementary teaching is to do a school community study, right? So whatever school they're working with or a school in their community, they have to do a school community study where they either, it used to be before COVID, like a walking tour, and you had to go and look at different resources of a community. Is there an after school program? Is there a boys and girls club? What languages are spoken? Take some images of the buildings. Get to know, right, who, what the community is that you're serving, and do it from a funds of knowledge or an asset-based perspective. Right, not looking at, well, what are some potential deficits, right? Especially it gets tricky when students are going to schools where maybe it's a community where they didn't grow up in, right? We want to avoid a deficit lens to this, right? We go over community cultural wealth, which is a framework by Tara Yoso that really talks about what are the different capitals that our students have, right? Some of you are bilingual, trilingual. Some of you were translators for your parents, right? I know I translated for my parents and I continue to do that. That's a capital, right? That's something that I bring to the table. Many students have familial capital where, their families are incredibly involved in their decision-making and part of their journey, right? So how do we validate those forms of knowledge and being, right? There's a theory that I really like by Ginwright and Gamarota. They talk about social justice youth development model. So if you're a teacher at the TK through 12 level or beyond, and you want to emphasize social justice, and you want your students to begin or continue, I should say, to do this equity work, but there's really two major components as a teacher that you should focus on. One is developing critical consciousness, right? So learning the language around the isms, right? What is racism? What is heterosexism? What does it mean to be an ableist? What does it mean to be an ageist, right? And unpacking that, and what does it look like in our communities, right? For students of color, for folks of color, we already know that these things exist, but we might not necessarily have the language to be able to interpret our experiences, right? And then for other folks, it's very important to understand that these are the experiences, right? And the forms of privilege that we all carry, right? To a different extent. And so that's one component of it. And often when I was a K through 12 teacher and now, I always got stuck on that. Like a lot of my class was focused on developing critical consciousness, but there's a whole other piece of it, which is, well, what about the praxis part? Like, what about the action part? So what do students do about it? Like, where's the hope, right? And the critical hope and the action. And so then that's when I began to incorporate student-led research projects in my K through 12 class, having them write personal narratives, having them engage with community organizations, because I wanted the critical hope to take part in my classroom, right? I'd love to get folks to share ideas. You're already doing it. What does this look like in your education courses, or hopefully your future education courses, if you're going to be a teacher and you're not in the classroom yet? How do you plan to implement anti-racist teaching practices in your content, right? In what you deliver in the classroom. Okay. So as folks are answering that in the chat, another area that I think we need to begin to unpack, or at least for myself, I try to unpack is, well, what does anti-racist teaching practices look like across my pedagogy, right? Because what I've often found, especially in professional development, or in my 1 year, I was a teacher coach, and often the conversation was, well, this is the content that I want to teach, and I want to talk about, I want to talk about these issues with my kids, and yet their classroom was very traditional, right? Teacher facing forward, similar to what I'm doing now, right? The teacher facing forward, students facing forward, having kind of a whole class discussion sometimes, but very traditional, not a lot of dialogical learning, right? Somebody mentioned Freire in the chat. So what does it mean to be dialogical? Freire really challenged this idea of the banking model, right? Which is teachers depositing information into children. We know that our children come with so much knowledge and world and life experiences. And sometimes and often they're going to know things to a different level than we know, right? I, as a Chicana, do not know what it's like to be a Black man in this country, right? I do not know what it's like to be, continue to be working class. And so understanding the different layers of my own identity and understanding that I'm there learning alongside everyone else, right? Pedagogy also means experiential learning, right? So what are your students doing in the classroom, right? Is your classroom project-based? When you're planning your curriculum, what are your units end up in, right? Is it the traditional exam that over and over again, right, that only adheres to one form of knowing, right? Or do you engage in projects and presentations, in community connections, right? So for example, I might be an English teacher and maybe my students are doing a poetry unit. Am I only going to have them analyze poetry and write about it, or do I also have them write their own poetry? And can they perform it at a community coffee shop down the street, right? What does it mean, again, to be cemented in your students' lived experiences? The emphasis of group collaboration, right? And even examining power dynamics in group collaboration. I remember there was one point where I had a class of like 40 high school students, and I had a group project going. And I looked at the room and there were 7 different groups working on posters. And it dawned on me that all 7 groups had young women taking the notes on the poster and doing the bulk of the work, right? So I paused and we had a conversation around, what are the ways in which gender plays out in our distribution of labor, right, in the classroom? What does that look like? And I think that those are just some examples, right, of how even in our pedagogy, we have to always have a critical lens of how we perpetuate particular things as well, right? Student narratives are incredibly important. By the way, these images are some of the books that I either read in my teacher ed program or that I have my students read now at Pasadena City College. So in my intro to elementary teaching, one of our textbooks is Rethinking Elementary Teaching or Education, which has them looking at how they can carry out projects or different curriculum through again a racialized and critical lens, right? And then multicultural teaching in the early childhood classroom, I also use that for another class that I teach. And the importance of critical reading and problem posing, right? So are we having our students engage in research around areas in education that they're particularly passionate in? So the question is, well, what does this look like in your education courses, right? How might you engage in anti-racist or anti-oppressive pedagogy, or what Paulo Freire would say, like liberatory praxis, right? How do you make sure that your classroom is inclusive of who your students are, but again, is centered on equity? And so before I move on to the next section, wanted to show you a couple more images. The two books that you see there, that's a result of a 3-year project with some high school teachers. There was a group of 4 of us at Roosevelt High School who decided to do a senior project, and it turned into us doing it for 3 years in a row. We wanted our seniors to engage in research. We wanted them to engage in explanatory writing. And we wanted it to be culturally relevant and community focused. And so at the time, and this was the mid 2000s, one of the topics that came up in one of my classes was that, Boyle Heights, when you Googled it at that time, there was a lot of stigma and stereotypes around East Los Angeles and whether it was about, kind of gangs or whatnot, but it was very stereotypical. And we knew, right, living in that community, teaching in that community, that our community in Boyle Heights was incredibly rich, right? That had amazing history of resistance and revolution, had an incredible, cultural richness to it. And so we asked ourselves, well, what would it mean if we wrote about ourselves from our perspective, from the eyes of its youth? And so we had students interview people in their community. We had students write about particular landmarks, and then they wrote a book. We had someone who knew how to put a book together, put it on Amazon, and we used some of the kind of, we didn't make a whole lot of money, but some of the money that we made went back to the seniors and their senior dues, right? So Inner Global Village was the first one, and had lots of images there. The second year, we decided to do untold stories from Boyle Heights. This was for students who were able to interview people in their family or in their community who they felt had a voice, had a story to be told, right? And we had done this after reading short stories and really coming to this idea that everyone has a story, right? Everyone has a reason or examples of contributions, right? And so this was incredibly powerful. I remember one student who interviewed her mom, who had immigrated to this country. And it reminded me a lot of an assignment that I had in my undergrad experience for a Chicano studies class, where I had to interview my parents or 2 folks who had immigrated to this country. And I had never really known their story of what it meant for them to cross the border and the actual experience. And I remember that my student talking about learning so much about her mom and what she had gone through. And she was able to tell her story in an authentic way, right? So we created the second one. The third book, I was trying to find it and I couldn't find it before the presentation, but the third one was about what are some of their aspirations. So it had a futuristic lens to it, almost like science fiction, but also, there were some essays in there about what their future goals were. Others wrote kind of short stories with different characters, etc. Right. Some of the images there, again, my work with the Gay Straight Alliance. So understanding that gender and sexuality are not these separate identities. We talked about, well, what does it mean to be a queer person of color, right? What does it mean to be a student who is really identifying with these different communities? And so some of our field trips were very intentional, right? We didn't just go to the LGBT Center, which is a great center in West Hollywood. We went there once, but what we also found is that even in those spaces, whiteness persists, right? And what does it mean to also go to other spaces where we can see ourselves in those spaces as well? We put on a conference for a couple of years where we had 80 to 100 students from Roosevelt. They were from the actual school, take a couple of periods off. Their teachers would bring them, and they got a chance to listen to different speakers, talk about issues of sexuality, and other important issues for our students. And so that was an example of how you can do some of this work, yes, in your classroom, but some of it as a advisor, in your work outside of the class. Yeah. And again, any questions you might have, please type into the chat. We'll have some time hopefully at the end. Another area where we can engage in this work, or I think all of us attempt, right, to engage in critical work, is teacher-student relationships. We often don't talk about the importance of relationships, right? Or it gets commodified into like these trainings, right? Where I remember going into a training that talked about, you should shake your students' hands when they come in, and of course, I mean, prior to COVID, right? But of course, I wanted to do all of that, but it simplified it in such a way, and it didn't talk about, what does it mean to authentically care for students? Angela Valenzuela writes about this in her book, Subtractive Schooling, that one of the things that teachers have to be very careful about is that we don't engage in aesthetic caring, right? That's when we say, well, I care about my students, but I have a colorblind approach, right? I don't see race, right? And we want to move past that, because if you don't see race, then you don't see your students, or you don't see me, right? Because that's part of who I am. And so she argues that for teachers to really engage in authentic work, we have and authentically care is not just to say we care for our students, but to roll up our sleeves and say, I care enough about you that I'm going to become an advocate, right? Or I'm going to become an intervener and fight for racial justice, because I know that it's important for all of us, right? Critical care, another couple folks talk about, what does it mean to hold high expectations of your students, to understand maybe that some of them have had particular struggles, right? But to continue to have and hold high expectations, and to not lower your expectations of students, or to at all fall into this idea of the teacher as savior complex, right? And that's really important, that especially as we're coming into the profession, for those of you that are about to start teaching, kind of recognizing, your intentions for going into the profession, and making sure that that you learn about your students as much as possible. I always have students in my class that will say, or that might pose, well, I don't know too much about this culture, or it makes me a little bit nervous. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? And I think those are real concerns, right? And we often unpack that. Well, you don't have to be an expert in all of these cultures. You just have to allow the space for them to show you, right? I by no means am I an expert in even the Latinx culture, because it's so diverse, right? I might know a little bit about like Mexican culture and history, but I am still learning so much about Central America, about the history of Central America and different countries within that, right? El Salvador, Honduras, and then other cultures and races as well. So what does it mean to create assignments where students can bring in their knowledge, right? If you're going to have a unit on immigration or storytelling, can students do an assignment that allows them to talk about their own experiences, right? And you learn from them, right? Another piece of it too, now talking about my teacher ed self, is one of the things I've tried to do is one, reach out to students in different layered ways outside of my classroom, but not to necessarily center myself in that relationship, but to center the possibility of networking. So instead of me feeling like I need to talk to every single one of my students, of course, being available to them, then maybe I can create a mentorship program at PCC, which we did this past year, where students who are first gen or who are looking for a faculty mentor, then what I can do is try to get faculty mentors who are up for volunteering their time, get students who are interested, and be a networking bridging agent and connecting them, but removing myself from their interactions, right? So there's different ways to obviously engage in this work. Lots of great ideas that folks are sharing into the chat. I love that. One of the challenges of this year, right? And I know we're all like 1+5 years in Zoom world, and it's getting harder, right? Where, one of the realities is, I have less students coming to my synchronous classes than I did at the beginning of the year. Your teachers are tired. right? And so how do we continue to engage in meaningful work, even in the virtual setting? One of the things, at least on a pedagogical sense, is flexibility and humanizing learning for students. So being incredibly flexible, understanding that some of my students have had very intense experiences this past year, right? And understanding my privilege and that I've still been able to work from home, and many of us have. And so what does it mean to be incredibly flexible? In terms of the programming that we've done at Hixon, we've tried to really center identity and center anti-racist teaching practices in terms of the speakers that we bring. So one of the events that we had was teaching to empower young men of color. This is a former colleague of mine, but does a lot of work around young men, and particularly around young Latinx men. He started a group called Urban Scholar Compadres at Roosevelt High School, where they use research to begin to challenge issues in the community and at the school level. When we think about technology, right, we often talk about technology in our teaching. Why not integrate equity and technology? Right. Again, these topics are not separate. Mariana Ramirez did a talk for us where she worked with high school students around GIS mapping, and they were able to do GIS mapping in their community to look at, okay, what types of communities have the most resources, right? Looking at Los Angeles and looking at the disparities across different pockets of Los Angeles to use their data to be able to make arguments and to make presentations to city officials with data backing them up, right? We recently did a talk on teaching equity through children's literature. And so as a professor of intro to elementary teaching, we briefly talk about the use of children's literature to hit some of the Common Core standards in ELA. But what does it mean to center, again, gender, race, class, sexuality in children's literature? And she had a great kind of conversation with students. There was a student in that particular talk who said, well, how do you deal with parents that are going to get upset when I talk about these things, or when my students read books about these topics? And she understood, but she also challenged, and she said, we need to be mindful, not just of the one parent who's going to get upset because you're talking about racism. She said, you need to be careful about me because I'm a parent, and I will call you if you're not talking about these topics that are important to me and my children, right? And I think that kind of flipped it, where who do we center in our narratives, right? Who do we center in our ideas of who we're teaching for, and how we craft our pedagogy? I thought that was, for me, it was a good kind of reminder of shifting our and reimagining our intentions. Okay. So I want to stop here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But as we think about, equity, right? And we've seen this image repeatedly. I think some of us, the difference between equality, equity, of course, reality, and liberation, right? An example I have of this is, when we think about all the barriers and challenges that teachers have to become teachers, right? We all have to take the CBEST and the CSET. Equality would be, all of us have to take the CSET, right? But the reality is that, when we look at test scores or tests, they are barriers for really great potential teachers, right? And discouraging to some teachers who would be amazing, right? Equity would be, do we provide additional resources for students who we know need additional support for the CBEST or CSET? But liberation might be, well, let's just remove the CSET and CBEST altogether, right? Because we know that they're not measures of good teaching, right? And sometimes it's hard to, well, what would that look like? And oh my goodness, then how would we measure? Liberation is harder for us, right? Because it means we have to be creative And there's not like one answer, right? We have to use our imagination to re-envision what does it mean to not play by the same rules that we've been playing with, right? So how will you center equity in your classroom or in your programs, which so many of you are already doing just great work. So if you can go back to the Jamboard, right? And I wanted to give you a little bit of a chance. Some of you maybe have started here. I want you to write down one practice that you commit to in your current or future classroom. What is one practice or one, equity-oriented, pedagogical content, teacher-student relationship focused practice that you commit to? And I'll give you about a minute for that. And as folks are answering that, I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. So if you can type your questions into the chat, I'll try to answer them in order if possible. And some folks are saying about a certificate. Yes, I will follow up with folks in the next couple of days with that. I'll make sure to look at the registration.
Yeah, I had people private messaging me, so I just put a note in the chat saying if they wanted a certificate to put like need certificate in their email address so we'd know who it was that wanted them.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Bobby. You were super helpful.
No
So
problem.
Yeah. So as folks
I'm going to
are
drop
writing,
that link again because just in case some latecomers didn't have that link.
please. So co-creating with students, incorporating multicultural perspectives and content area, treating every child as my own child, right? No favoritism. It's so important. I remember doing a community contract with students at the beginning of every year, my high school students, and even with some of my folks at the teacher ed level. And we would come up with guidelines together and we would choose which ones were priorities and everyone would sign. And the one that always came up first and foremost were, Miss, we don't want you to have favorites. And we want you to treat everyone the same, or and of course, like that made sense. And I think especially with young folks and young children, this idea of justice is very present for them. Like you don't have to talk young people into believing in justice. Like it inherently comes from them. If anything, it's the adults, right, that get lost in translation of what that looks like for folks. Right. So I want to pause here. We have about 7 or 8 minutes. Please drop a couple of questions. Any questions you have about anything that I talked about, I'd love to engage with folks. Or if you want to use the mic, please feel free to do that as well.
So my question is, how can we help the students focus on expanding their thoughts of not only their own race, but everybody else's race, and still teach them everything they need to learn for the testing that most teachers are centered on now?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. It's going to depend on your grade level that you teach, because I'm assuming you're talking about TK through 12th grade, and your school, right? So for me, I was very lucky. It was challenging, but I was very lucky that I taught at the high school level, and my principal gave us a lot of flexibility with curriculum. As long as I was hitting the standards, right, I was able to incorporate and create curriculum from scratch. And I did that with a couple of friends who worked at Roosevelt. We all started together and we would spend Saturdays like lesson planning together, thinking about backwards planning. And we kept our own data. That was our way to defend ourselves, right? I'm going to show you that my students are growing in their skill set because look, this is the assessment we gave them at the beginning of the semester. Here's the rubric. This is the next assessment that we gave them, and we were able to show growth, right? When I taught high school, we had the KC, which was the high school exit exam. They got rid of it, but it wasn't like I was doing equity work 100% of the time. And I think that's important, at least to admit that I had a group of students who had to pass the CASE. They were English language learners, and they had just a couple chances to pass. It was an awful exam in that even if students had all A's, and if they didn't pass it, they wouldn't graduate. So we did CASE boot camps. And I started the session by saying, this test does not define you. This test does not measure your intelligence, but this is, sadly, this is the game. So let's figure out how to learn the game so we can beat it, right? Now at the elementary level, you all deal more with scripted curriculum, right, than we do at the middle school and high school level to a certain extent. And one of the things that came up in the speaker that came to present is she gave snapshots of, okay, if this is the scripted curriculum, then what can I do to supplement? What can I do to bring in other stories, and then make my case with my principal to say, well, look, a lot of these scripted curriculums don't even have students read a whole chapter. They don't even have them read a whole story. It's just snippets. One of the standards is for them to be able to talk about the beginning, middle, and end of a story. So I need to bring in a story for my students to be able to meet that standard. So I think it's knowing the standards well enough so that you know how to bend them a little bit, right? And some of them are going to be easier than others. Like, to be honest, like English is very flexible, I think, versus math. But I've seen teachers do social justice work in math, right? I've seen them do project-based learning in math. I think so much of it is surrounding yourself also with the right folks, and then making sure that you're going to the trainings that give you examples. Hopefully that helps a little bit. But it's definitely a real challenge in this context. Yeah. What do you suggest a teachable moment when a student makes derogatory?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. What
So
do you suggest a teachable moment?
basically, it's you putting that extra foot forward.
Yeah. Sorry, Pro. I think there's a little bit of a delay, but thank you though. Teachable moment that students make a derogatory statement about another's faith or culture. That's hard. The first thing that comes to mind when I was teaching K through 12 I was teaching high school, sexism was real, right? Some of my students who I loved and were super critical when it came to issues of race and class, sometimes said super sexist things. Like, we were reading Of Mice and Men, and they were blaming, if you've read it, they were blaming Curly's wife for her death, right? Because they said something kind of crazy where it was like, oh, she shouldn't have done this. She, kind of this idea of she shouldn't have dressed this way. And so that, I think, was a moment where I had to really, really dig deep into my facilitation skills, right? Take a step back, because my other students, because we had been fine-tuning our critical thinking and skills, right? I could simply say, does anyone disagree with what he just said? And then my students came in. Now, if no student would have come in, I would have challenged that, right? And I think there's always this kind of conversation about how do we be objective in the classroom? How do we present both sides? I think it's also important to challenge that a little bit. Yes, of course, we want students to be critical thinkers. We don't want to bring in our personal biases to the table, but yet the current curriculum as it is not objective. It's very biased in that it presents one way of being, right? If we look at a history book, in the US history book, it presents history from a very kind of singular lens, right? So I think this idea of neutrality is a myth. That doesn't mean that I'm going to force my ideas, in students' faces, but it does mean, where's this idea of me always presenting these both sides coming from, right? And kind of problematizing that a little bit. But students will notice if you let a teachable moment go by. I've had students tell me, Miss, in your class, we can't say this word, but in Mr. So-and-so's, students say it all the time, and he never says anything, right? homophobic remarks or whatnot. So they notice, right, when you don't necessarily do that. Now, did every single, problematic statement become a teachable moment? I would have had to stop, teaching my content like all the time. So there were moments where I just shut down statements, right? If a student said something, I talked to them, but right away shut it down. And so that my students would know that language this is not the kind of community that we've worked so hard to create, right? And then there were other moments where it became a conversation and we deviated from the curriculum substantially, right? So
Thank
I
you
want
so
to
much
thank
for
you.
that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
It was
you
an
wanna add
interesting
anything?
moment. Yeah, it was an interesting moment. I don't know if it was faith, sexual orientation, or anything, but it was so to that level where I had a parent conversation and the parent didn't even understand what was bad about the joke.
Yeah.
And it was a difficult time, but I had to say something because there were kids in the room. This is elementary. And it was a challenging time to be calm and handle it. So we have to be the person in the room, and the worst thing is to ignore it.
Yeah, thank you. I think, you don't know who's listening. I mean, actually, you do know everyone's listening, even when you think they're not. When I came out to my students, I didn't come out to them the first couple of years of teaching. I came out to my Gay Straight Alliance years later. It took me a while. And I remember a student who had graduated already got a hold of me and said, "Miss, I wish you would have come out when I was in high school." Now that was a personal decision I made, and I don't regret that, because we all come to come out in different ways, and no one, you don't ever have to come out if you don't want to. But it did make me think about, well, students are listening, and who we are and what we put out there like has an impact on them. And there's a lot of, we have to be careful that we don't do harm, but that we're in this to do good, right? And to work with communities. But I want to be respectful of time. Thank you so much for being here. I know that it's Thursday at 4 p.m. and you've been a little zoomed out, but thank you again. And then I'll make sure to follow up with certificates in the next couple of days. But thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.